Well, hello again, all my vintage dirt bike loving YouTubers, and thanks once more for giving up your valuable time to join me here on Classic Dirt Bike TV. Now, I've always strived to bring you the very best quality vintage and classic dirt bike racers here on CDB TV, and in the next featured clip, I'd like to think that I've found you another of those long lost iconic off-road two-wheelers. So I do hope you'll stick around for the next few minutes as we check out Stewart Roden's 1974 John Banks CCM. Now, although this bike looks like it's another of those remanufactured Clews CCMs, and I suppose that may be partly true in certain respects, although this bike nevertheless was originally ridden by the great man himself, John Banks, back in 1974. Now, naturally, straight away you can see that maybe not all of the bike's fixtures and fittings are from that classic 1974 era, but that's mainly due to the bike's current owner, Stewart Roden, who didn't want to own the bike as a showpiece but wanted to use it as a proper race bike, and so some of the older worn out 1970s parts on the bike were changed to make it a bit more user friendly. But nevertheless, the bike's frame, swing arm, top and bottom triple clamps, fuel tank and front and rear brake hubs are all original parts of the John Banks machine, and Stewart also has the original motor, as this one that is fitted here is one of Stewart's own power plants. So basically, the one and only reason that Stewart has changed certain aspects of this bike's appearance was because he was going to race the bike and not just place it in a corner of his workshop as a nice looking talking point. Now, the bike's frame is a genuine John Banks chassis, although back in the day, of course, this would have been nickel plated for 1974, although it's now been chromed because Stewart told me that certain aspects of the nickel plating were beginning to peel due to the bike's advancing years. Now, this particular motor featured here is not the original 4-speed B50 MX engine that John Banks raced back in the day, although Stewart still has that 1974 John Banks power plant that was fitted to the chassis still lying in his workshop. Now, because Stewart was going to race the bike, he didn't want to damage the original older motor, and so he's replaced it with this similar B50 500 MX engine of his own, which has the standard 3-speed gearbox. But this engine's basically stock, apart from a new conrod and piston which Stewart changed purely on safety grounds, although apart from that this is a relatively standard BSA B50 500 MX motor. And in this shot we can see the bike's folding kickstart assembly and that relatively short gear change lever. Now, these big single cylinder BSA derived B50 engines had a straight through big bore exhaust system, straight through pipe that led onto this little tailpipe that exited from the right hand side of the bike, and we'll be able to catch a listen to what this engine sounds like later in the video. Now, I'm not entirely sure what type of carburetor was fitted to these big CCMs back in 1974, but it probably would have been an old Amal of some type or description. But in our particular case, Stewart has gone for an Italian made big bore Dell'Orto carburetor on this particular machine. Now you can see here that Stewart's changed the original footrests for a pair of these wider and much more user-friendly foot pegs. Now I've always wondered why manufacturers always like to fit those skinny footrests onto old dirt bikes when these wider parts give your feet much more support. And as you can also see, CCM used the side casings to mount the footrest hangers rather than bolt them onto the bike's chassis. Now these John Banks frames used the chassis to store the engine's oil lubrication, and the oil was filled through this little filler cap just ahead of the fuel tank. Now when John Banks rode this bike, it would have been fitted with a pair of CZ front suspension units, although for some reason John Banks was always bending them during racing, and Stewart told me that he had the very same problem when he rode these old CCMs back in the 1970s. But these particular front forks are tougher BSA units, which are bolted onto these original CCM front and rear brake hubs, which are another very rare original part to find for these older Alan Clews race machines. Now, because Stewart intended to race the bike, he certainly wanted better suspension units on the machine rather than the originals that were fitted, and so he's opted for a pair of these Dutch-made Riger shocks. Now these Riger shocks are excellent quality and very strong, and are, as you would expect, much better than any equivalent British-made suspension units from that 1970s period. Now this alloy fuel tank is not a replacement unit, as this is the bike's factory-made tank from 1974. It's not often that you see an original fuel cell from an old CCM bike in this kind of condition these days, and this example is in superb condition, and of course it comes complete with its Monza style snap-shut fuel cap on top. Now, as you would expect, the bike's original seat was a bit worse for wear, and certainly not a place to place your backside down on if you wanted to protect the family jewels come race day. So Stewart had this much better part manufactured with a bit more extra padding to make the ride a bit more comfortable, and the new seat of course was finished off with a very high quality embroidered CCM logo on the rear, and this was all done by Transcal Automotive of Livingston in Scotland. Now the bike's top and bottom triple clamps are the original parts from the 1974 John Banks machine, although Stewart has also added a pair of bar risers just to increase the handlebar height at the front of his race bike. Now he's also fitted a pair of these circuit handguards, and that was done just to help keep stones and other debris from banging on his knuckles. Now the levers and their covers are very high quality Magura items, and the yellow control cables are all made by Venhill. But once again, Stewart's changed the older original alloy wheels purely as a safety issue, and fitted these gold anodized Acront rims, because first and foremost, of course, this is still essentially a classic race bike and not a museum piece, and Stewart wanted to make sure that the wheels wouldn't fall apart the first time he took the bike onto the track. And that rather intimidating rear sprocket and heavy duty Regina chain have the job of putting the raw power of that B50 500 motor onto the track. And as I mentioned earlier, it's still very rare to find these older original CCM front and rear brake hubs. Now the plastics are replacement as yet again the originals were faded and quite weak and not suitable any longer for racing, but nonetheless Stewart still has all the original parts from this John Banks racer. Now of course when Stewart first took possession of this John Banks CCM, he could quite easily have just kept the bike in its original state and then used it as a historic talking point whenever he went to bike shows and the like. Although Stewart always wanted to race this bike on the track, and the parts that he did swap were mainly to enable him to put it on the racetrack and make it into a competitive motorcycle that he could race in the vintage pre-1975 class. But nevertheless, the bike still has a certain amount of racing history with the great John Banks as its rider, and during his illustrious racing career, Banks in 1977, as you remember, took an inspired second position in the 500cc British Grand Prix, where he crossed the line just behind a certain flying Finn called Heikki Mikkola, who was riding a Yamaha, and he also finished ahead in that race to Graham Noyce, who was riding a Honda. And so there you have it. We've talked a little bit about this classic CCM and its historic connection with John Banks. So there's only one thing really left to do, and that's to get Stewart to fire the bike up, and let's all have a listen to what she sounds like. And so I do hope you've enjoyed taking a look and a listen to Stewart's lovely CCM. And don't forget, if these old vintage race bikes are the stuff that you like to look at here on YouTube, then please just subscribe to my channel. So until next time, be safe and ride safe until we speak once again here on Classic Dirt Bike TV. This video was brought to you in association with WealthSport, the world's #1 supplier for all your off-road, sports and leisure wear. Just visit their online website at wealthsport.com for more details.